So we have a presentation from Welch Comer about the Atlas Waterfront Project. Mr. Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and board members. Okay, so just a brief project update today. This project update will give you some context for a discussion you're going to have later with your budget. So last month, I gave you a project update. So I started keeping a little bit of a running total. For the commissioners, you see this, some of you see this once a month. For some of you that are on the steering committee, see it a little more frequently. And so I thought it would be useful just to touch briefly on what the last update was, kind of refresh everybody's memory, then jump into it. You guys are not as immersed in it as much as Tony and I are. So on the 20th, I talked about project phasing, the proposed urban renewal district boundaries. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the observations we had at the steering committee meeting, our preliminary project schedule, and then the budget considerations for the Lake and River District. So this is the phasing I talked about last week, gave you guys some of the background on why it's configured in such a way it is. The gist of it is minimize the capital up front, maximize the developable property. And that's obviously to make the financial model be as black as it can be and not in the red. This was the boundaries of the urban renewal district we talked about, and the only part of this that has changed is this corridor through here. As Tony and Danielle and I talked about that some more, Danielle had made a good observation about there's really no difference of the boundary being here or moving it slightly north to capture all of those lots. So I'm zooming in, and you can see where the boundary has moved. It used to be here. And so now it moves up to here. So it captures lots into the Atlas district, which has the longest life, but it does not put any cost burden on that district because the infrastructure still remains in the river district. So hopefully that all makes sense. I think it was a good observation, and we went ahead and made that change. So we want to make sure that we're keeping the board current on the district boundaries. We don't necessarily see any other changes at this point moving forward unless the board has some other observation that we haven't thought of. So that was kind of just a recapture of the last project update. Met with the steering committee on July 10th, and the primary objective of that meeting was to review the extremely complicated financial model. And there were several of the commissioners there that are numbers people, and they loved it. And we talked numbers for probably 2 hours. And so, again, the objective of that is to really provide some of the commissioners and the council people, Mayor Widmeyer, really detailed information and background. So it's more than just my team that is involved in kind of understanding those numbers. Also discuss some next steps in the preliminary schedule and then the Lake and District funding needs. The bottom line of the financial model is that it runs in the black. We're going to continue to make some tweaks to it based on some of the observations that the board members and the council members and Mayor Widmeyer had, and we'll be finalizing that with a final presentation to the steering committee tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow. So then on the next steps in the preliminary schedule, this is a pretty detailed schedule. But the objective is to kind of show four big components of this project. One is the urban renewal district process, the land entitlements, the infrastructure, and then the land transaction. Because this kind of, it segues into the budget discussion. The urban renewal district process up here, this is the process that Danielle and Tony have defined. You can see we're starting through it, and there's some key milestones up here, the Planning Commission meeting, City Council meeting, the 2 City Council meetings with the objective of completing it before the end of the year. The next section you see in here is the entitlements, and you kind of see them all starting in September. That's probably just what it's going to take to get geared up and get some action items for the board. You see the infrastructure that starts, and there's 2 parts to the infrastructure. One part is the public space, and the other part is the infrastructure necessary to support the development. The premise we've been operating under through guidance from the steering committee is the property is in city ownership. The funding exists a portion of the funding exists for the public space. Let's move forward and get that public space in a condition that makes it usable sooner than later. Under this schedule, that would happen in 2019, which obviously requires some Ignite funding. In addition to that, we want to tee up the infrastructure improvements to facilitate the land transaction, which is down below here. But just a short blurb about the land transaction, we don't want to pull the trigger, or you don't want to pull the trigger on completing infrastructure improvements until you actually have some of the blocks sold. And that's why you see this infrastructure construction happening later in 2019, which still involves some of the budget, the Lake and River District budget, or actually it's really just the River District budget. And that's under this idea of by the time we pre-market, run an RFP, and move through that process, do some negotiation, the builders do their feasibility analysis, we won't actually have a waiver of feasibility until the middle of next year. So I know there's a lot of details up there, and you guys might be ripe for questions. We went through some of this concept with the steering committee. We'll go through it in greater detail tomorrow. So where it falls out and how it weaves into your budgeting process is this is the estimated project costs for phase one by district. And the two that I think you'll be talking about today, or you will be talking about today, are the River District and Lake District, and the budgets that would could be considered by the board. Did I capture all that, Tony?
Mm-hmm.
So I know.
Point of clarification, the funding you see for the Atlas District will be a loan from the River District, and that loan amount is included in the proposed fiscal year 2019 budget for the River District that we'll talk about.
One other clarification point that you'll see in here is the shoreline stabilization line item. If you were to look back on previous ones, you would see there was an estimated cost in there of about 1.4 million. As we worked through the financial model and Tony worked through his budgets, I think we've made it a little bit clear that there's probably some grant funding available to either the district or the city. And the approach here was to pull that expense out and really chase hard for the funding agencies, or the grant, if we can secure some grant funding from that. We had done a field tour with some of the entities that have those funds and had some positive response for them. So in order to kind of make things work, we pulled that out. So a lot of information up there, and glad to answer any questions that you might have, but it's really kind of a teeing this up for your budget discussion that happens later.
Any questions from the board to Phil?
Okay, all good? Okay, the next topic that we have to cover on our agenda is the transportation, or the traffic impact study. We talked about that last week. The board asked us to go back and get more detail back about it and bring back a more complete study. There were some good comments from Commissioner English, and we made some tweaks to it, but rather than me trying to stand up here and channel a true transportation engineer, Melissa Cleveland from our office, who is a transportation engineer, is here to talk through that and make a presentation and answer questions on the scope of the project. So I will turn it over to Melissa. F5. There, now it's all yours.
So do I just push
You,
this to go through?
Yeah, or use the mouse. And then-
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Phil kind of introduced this topic at your last meeting, I believe. And since then, we've changed the boundary a little bit, kind of based on some comments from you all. And so this is the new boundary. We captured this intersection at Lakewood and Ironwood, and then we kind of pulled over Emma and La Crosse to 95 to really make sure that we captured everything that could be an impact from the new development. Just to kind of recap on the objectives of this study, we really need to look at the existing cause of the current traffic congestion. I think that when people think about development down in this area, it's like, oh gosh, it's already so congested. And so to look at what's happening now, what can improve, and then look at what happens when we add additional traffic to this already congested network, and be able to understand the impacts of that additional traffic, and to evaluate different connections. I know that as part of Phil's work with the Atlas Waterfront, there's been different connections and routes proposed, and rather than go off gut feel on which would be the best alternative, we'll be able to actually evaluate those different connections and alternatives and do what makes the most sense for the transportation network. And then we can recommend mitigations, which would be improvements to the system to help alleviate that congestion that you're seeing. And for our methods, this is kind of a recap from last time, just so you remember. We're going to do an origin destination study, and just to remind you, that's where we understand right now for people coming in and out of that whole area, Riverstone area, where are they coming from and where are they going to? And that helps us when we're developing the traffic model to really calibrate that model so that it's accurately representing what's happening now and what will happen. We are going to take some traffic volume data so that we have new and accurate counts, and that'll also help us to calibrate the model to the conditions that are out there. So a little more detail on what the origin destination study is. We use location-based data that comes from GPS on vehicles. So all of you drive a car. If it's a newer car, it has GPS in it. And apps on cell phones, believe it or not. So any app, even your weather app, has that location-based sensor in it. And so all the data gets mined from that and given to us, and when it's given to us, it's all anonymous at that point. There's another firm that goes through and kind of takes any of the personal information out, but it gives us, we don't have to guess anymore. It's not assumption-based model anymore. Now we know where people are coming from and where they're going to, and we can develop the model to really accurately reflect that. The traffic data collection will be using video counters, and those counters will allow us to capture, we're going to do them all simultaneously, so it will reduce the amount of error and balancing that we have to do in the model, because if you take them at different times, then you have to figure out, well, what was different at this time of day than this, or what was different on Tuesday than Wednesday, that kind of thing. So if they're all simultaneously taken, that kind of, again, it just reduces your error, it reduces the assumptions that I have to make when I'm modeling it, and gives you more accuracy. This was just a picture, because I don't know if you can see. The camera's way up here, and there's kind of a collection device down here, a big pole that it sits on. So we can collect all the turning movements, so we'll know the left, rights, through movements. It also splits out trucks, pedestrians, bicycles, so we'll have that at all of these 14 locations that we show here on this map. So that will give us a really good basis for our model. The modeling portion, since we're going to have all this new great data, and then we will also use trip generation and land use to kind of build a future condition model. Then we're going to use that to look at, like I said, all the different routes that may occur. We will allow for route choice in the model, so that'll help us to understand maybe where the new traffic will go, or if there's a new connection, does that alleviate, does that change travel patterns? But it's really important to note that we have to vet all of that with common sense. The model is just a tool, and so we have a lot of good data and the OD data to kind of help us vet and say, this makes sense. Well, you know, when it's all said and done, we're not just pushing go on the model and that's what it says. No, we're still vetting that through a common sense process that will include the city engineer and the planning department too. So then, you know, this tool, what it does is it allows us to develop mitigation strategies. And I think that that's the end goal is if we're developing, we already kind of have an issue out there. If we're developing and adding more traffic, what are we going to do to fix these intersections? So we think that public involvement is really important, and we plan on using GIS and our mapping tools to make any presentation really clear to convey to the public all this pretty technical information. We're proposing 2 public meetings. One would be kind of in the data collection phase, and that would be because I think in the community, this area and the congestion that's already happening is a pretty hot topic, and I think that people will have a lot of good insight and information to kind of supply to us. So it will be more of, that first meeting will be more of a information gathering, you know, and just being very transparent to the public that this is what we're doing, and come to us with your thoughts about this area. And then the second one would be more towards the end, where it's here's what the results are, here's what mitigations we're proposing, and just make sure that everyone, that it's all a very transparent process. And again, it'll be super close coordination with the city engineer, with ITD, since they, of course, control Northwest Boulevard and I-90 through that, the big chunk of that corridor, and the street and planning departments from the city. So I put this just kind of quick schedule together. Hopefully we can get going right away and get some traffic data collected in July and August. Then we'll work on our existing conditions model in August and September. And we'll probably have the public meeting as early in that existing conditions process as really feasible. Then we'll look at kind of the future conditions model. All along, we'll be coordinating with the city and vetting everything that we're coming up with through them. Then towards the end, we'll be looking at more of an informational public meeting and the final report. So I went through that really fast, so I don't know if anyone has questions.
Any board questions?
I actually have a couple of
Okay.
questions. Just curious why the data collection time was from 2 to 7 p.m. and not morning, during a morning commute kind of congestion period?
Well, we could certainly do that, but in the counts that we've taken elsewhere on Northwest Boulevard, though it's been closer to downtown, the peak really is starting about 2 and going to 7.
I was just
And
curious.
so, I mean, I could collect more, but you know, it's the cost in collecting and is in processing it, processing all that data. So, I mean, it would probably.
And also, just being a parent of school-aged children, I know the traffic flows changes drastically once school starts, so
I've heard that as well. I've heard that from other people.
it's very different when, you can even tell during the middle of the school year, if there's a day there's no school, it's oddly.
So different. You know, I've heard that. You're not the
Driving
first
around.
person who's mentioned that.
Yeah. So I
And
just,
so-
from a timing standpoint, I don't know if that would have an impact or not, but I anecdotally feel like that there is a difference when school's in session.
I agree with you. I guess one comment that I have is that summer is still going to be worse. It's still going to be the worst congestion. So if we're kind of looking at, you know, we don't design for the 4th of July. We don't look at that, but we look at kind of an average peak day. And so I think that I need, in my mind, to take what you're saying, because you're not the first person who said that travel patterns do change during school. And maybe I can figure out a way to get origin destination data to give us a little guidance on that. But I still believe that we're gonna see the most congestion on your typical summer day.
And I just like I said, anecdotally from my
Yeah,
personal experience
right.
in driving around, I just was curious how that, if that does have an impact, or if looking at it during I realize summer is
Yeah, I
Much
think that it
different.
does, and I think it's worthy of
consideration. at
thought
least.
and consideration.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you. I
yeah,
appreciate that.
absolutely.
I appreciate that.
Well, just following up on that too, as I noticed, live in Coeur d'Alene Place and work down at Lakewood, and actually when North Idaho colleges, and so, I mean, there's a big
Yeah.
difference between when they're in session, and I would say, actually in that case, by far it's heavier in the morning, because that's when they're all coming in the morning, and then throughout the day, they taper out of there at different times. But, and then in terms of, you're going to do 2 to 7, and then are you doing like every day for August, September, or a certain amount
No,
of days?
it'll all happen on one day, and so
Oh,
we'll.
one day?
Yep, all of that's simultaneous. Yeah, I think that that's really important.
Okay.
To just reduce the amount of error in the model. Yep, and so I'll work with the city. We need to pick a good day, because it needs to be a day that there's not construction happening that would alter traffic patterns, that there's not an event going on that would alter, it's got to be
Good
really
luck
well
on
thought
that one.
out. Yeah, it's got to be thought out, so, yep.
Commissioner Jordan?
Just two questions. So it's more accurate to pick a day than to have several days and take a blend. Is that what you're
Yeah.
saying? All right.
As far as modeling goes, because if I don't, then I'm going to have different data, and I'm not going to be able to say, I'm going to have to try to figure out what happened between the 2 days that's different. And that just, anytime we enter assumptions into the model, which traffic engineering is a lot of assumptions, but the more you can eliminate those assumptions, the more accurate you get with your modeling.
Yeah, it just seems like it would be better to have 2 or 3 good days than just try to pick one good day and hope that was a good day. But you're the expert at that. The other question, I don't suppose there's any hope there will be another freeway interchange between Northwest Boulevard and 41 at some point. It always seemed like there should have been one at Hutter Road,
Right.
but I don't know if the only hope of that would be if the state ever gets funding to do the bypass somehow.
Byway,
I don't.
yeah.
So ultimately, we've got too much loading onto Northwest Boulevard, and
Right.
41 is too far away, so I don't know ultimately what we do about that.
Yeah,
So you don't know any more on that either.
no,
Scope.
It's
not right
unfortunate.
now.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
Just a couple comments. So, just so the board knows, as I share with you, the projected cost for this study is $87,800. Just so everybody knows that. And the other question to Melissa, how will we share with the public when the public meetings will be held? And how do we invite them? How do we post that? Have we thought about that? Or is that still to come?
That would be still to come, but I would think that we would want to use the city's social media and paper and the websites to get the word out as good as possible. How have you done it with Atlas? Same? Okay. Yeah.
Tony, you're right, you project this at 87,800, but there was some discussion about having other participants, property owners in the area, participate in the cost of the analysis. Was any feedback on that?
Yes, I reached out, so as Commissioner Arman alludes to, can you throw that map back up?
Yeah.
So maybe if I can drive from here, see if I can take,
There we go, that one's bigger.
I can drive from here. So over on the west side of the study area over here, a gentleman named Lance Douglas has River's Edge Apartments, is going to develop apartments in this area. Oh, I lost it, there it is, right in here. And over on this area, we have Active West Development, Dennis Cunningham trying to acquire this Union Pacific property to do some residential product in this area. So I reached out to Mr. Cunningham to sense his willingness to maybe, the idea was maybe we split this 4 ways, the city, Ignite, and a couple of developers. He's interested, but not so much at 25%. You know, he doesn't think his project's going to impact it that much, but, you know, he left the door open for further conversation. And the city was going to reach out to Mr. Douglas, which they have yet to do. So we don't know about his willingness. But as Melissa pointed out and Phil alluded to, this time of year is a really good time to do traffic studies. So we don't want to let this linger and shelf this, waiting on potential other partnerships. So I reached out and talked to the mayor and Troy today to see if the city would be willing to step up and split this, potentially with Ignite, to get this effort underway. And they both were agreeable to pursuing that, so.
And then anything we collect, we'll split equally back between the two agencies?
Absolutely, Commissioner. Absolutely, yeah. So, but as we know, this is, you probably just need to take the leadership of the city and Ignite to get this off the dime, get it going, get it dialed in so we can get this information back by December.
So basically what we're doing is we're restructuring the contract with Welch Comer, is that correct?
Amendment number 4,
Okay.
that would take into this traffic study that Ms. Cleveland outlined at $87,800. And we have, Mr. Boyd has prepared an amendment to the contract that we, if the board so approved, with the cost-sharing proposal that was just discussed, I think we're going to move forward.
I move to approve amendment number 4 for the execution of the data collection and the traffic study.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Do you
All
want to
opposed?
include in the motion your willingness to split this with the city?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Assuming they would agree to that, which they have tentatively agreed to, so we'll pursue that. Thank you.
Any opposed? Motion carried.
She's got
Thank
work.
you, Melissa.